Hey guys, today we begin with a gentle walk through history's darkest corners, learning how people were forced to work from the very first cities beside the Tigris and Euphrates all the way to hidden factories and homes in our own time. We'll watch the chains change shape but never truly disappear, and we'll listen for the quiet songs of hope that kept the human spirit alive in every age. Tonight, we uncover 5,000 years of courage, pain, and unbreakable resilience. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or television remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, where humanity first pressed wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay, the earliest forms of slavery began not with chains, but with accounting. Imagine the slow-moving waters depositing layer upon layer of silt, much as debt accumulated upon the shoulders of the ancient Sumerians. In these early city-states Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, the first systematic records of human bondage appeared in carefully preserved tablets, often marked with the term Amas, the people who belong to another. The story begins with the harvest that failed, the fishing nets that returned empty, the unforeseen illness that prevented a farmer from working his fields. Debt was as natural as the river's rise, but when it couldn't be repaid, the ancient Sumerians offered what remained: their labor, their children's labor, sometimes their very personhood. A barley loan unpaid became 3 years of servitude. A silver debt led to children being sent to the household of the creditor. The cuneiform tablets tell us these stories with the same detached precision they used to record the movements of the stars. Unlike the slavery of later empires, these earliest bonds weren't necessarily permanent. Records from Nippur show families entering service for preset periods: 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 10, with the promise of release when the debt was considered paid. The creditors, often temple administrators or wealthy merchants, would provide food, minimal shelter, and the certainty that one's children would not starve. What began as economic necessity gradually crystallized into social structure, the human foundation upon which the ziggurats rose. In the shadow of these steppe temples, 2 distinct forms of bondage emerged by the 3rd millennium BCE. Temple slavery service to the gods themselves carried a certain dignity. Those who ground grain for Inanna's bread or tended the sacred gardens of Enlil were bound not merely to mortals but to divine purpose. The temple slaves lived in communal quarters, often better fed than free peasants. Their routines followed the precise rhythms of ritual obligation: water carriers at dawn, flour grinders by midday, weavers working until the evening star appeared. Private slavery in the households of the wealthy followed different patterns. Here, bondspeople might be found pressing olive oil in dim storerooms, carrying water up from the canals, or spinning wool for their owners' garments. Children born to slaves inherited their mother's status, creating generations bound to the same household. In the fields beyond the city walls, gangs of debt slaves dug irrigation channels under the merciless Mesopotamian sun, their labor transforming desert into green fields of barley and date palms. The canals they created, some still visible from satellite imagery, Toda, outlasted their nameless creators by millennia. The earliest known law code addressing slavery, the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 BCE, speaks of limits to bondage. Inscribed on tablets now crumbling with age, it declares, "If a man's slave, woman, comparing herself to her mistress, speaks insolently to her, her mouth shall be scoured with 1 selah of salt." Yet in the same code, we find the first protection slave who escaped and was recaptured could not be killed, only returned to service. These first tentative legal boundaries reveal a society beginning to grapple with the moral implications of owning another human being. Perhaps most intriguing was the Sumerian concept of forced kinship, the gradual absorption of slaves into the family unit. Long-serving slaves might eventually be adopted, particularly if they had special skills or had borne children to the master. Clay tablets record slave women becoming secondary wives, their children recognized as legitimate heirs. Bondage could, over generations, dissolve into belonging. As darkness falls across the floodplains, imagine the quiet moments when work finally ceased. In small reed huts on the edges of great estates, exhausted bodies rested on woven mats. The sound of mothers humming to their children floated across moonlit canals. The same lullabies would be sung in grand houses of mud brick, for sleep claimed both owner and owned alike. Gentle breezes stirred the reeds, creating whispered music that knew nothing of human divisions. The waters continued their ancient work of depositing silt, building the land grain by grain, just as human civilization was building itself through the cumulative labor of countless unnamed hands. The common image of Egyptian pyramid construction, thousands of slaves driven by whips under a merciless sun, exists more in Hollywood imagination than historical reality. The truth, revealed through archaeological evidence and ancient texts, paints a more nuanced picture of labor in the shadow of the pyramids. Egypt's agricultural rhythm, dictated by the annual flooding of the Nile, created a natural seasonal workforce. During these inundation months when farmland lay underwater, the pharaoh's officials would summon peasants through a system known as corvée labor. Unlike the chattel slavery that would later emerge in other civilizations, this was a temporary obligation, tax paid in sweat rather than grain. These workers retained their identity, their personhood, their connection to home villages. They were not property to be bought and sold, but citizens fulfilling a duty to their divine king and state. Records from the 4th dynasty tell us that work crews were organized into files of about 200 men, each with distinctive names like the Enduring Ones or Friends of Khufu. These teams competed for honor and extra rations. Their graffiti, scratched into hidden stones, still boasts of their accomplishments. The Vigorous Gang, or the Craftsmen of the Western Cemetery. These were not the markings of the utterly subjugated, but of those who took pride, however complicated, in their contribution. The worker village at Giza, excavated in the 1990s, has yielded remarkable insights into daily life. Their diet, surprisingly robust, included bread made from emmer wheat, beer rich in nutrients, roasted fish, and occasional meat fare superior to what many peasants consumed in their home villages. Evidence suggests workers received daily rations of about 4.5 pounds of bread and vegetables, plus several pints of beer. The state understood that monumental construction required well-fed laborers. Their housing, while basic, revealed thoughtful construction, grouped dormitories with raised sleeping platforms, central hearths, and designated cooking areas. The state provided linen kilts, sandals woven from palm fiber, and essential tools. When accidents occurred, and they did, with alarming frequency, medical attendants treated fractures, set broken bones, and applied poultices to wounds. Skeletal remains show healed injuries that would have required weeks or months of recovery, suggesting that injured workers weren't simply discarded, but allowed to heal before returning to lighter duties. Life was undeniably harsh by modern standards. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, limestone dust-filled lungs. Physical exhaustion was a constant companion. Yet hieroglyphic texts, including remarkable letters of complaint preserved on pottery shards and papyrus, give voice to these ancient laborers, their grievances surprisingly familiar across the millennia. "The scribe does not count our full work," complains one worker in a letter to his superior. "3 limestone blocks we moved yesterday go unrecorded." Another writes, "The ration oil is rancid, and the barley for our beer contains chaff. Are we not building the eternal house of Pharaoh? Should we not receive what is proper?" A particularly bold petition reads, "The overseer Khnumhotep strikes without cause. His hand is heavy while our backs break. Let justice be found." These weren't the voiceless masses often depicted in our imagination of ancient slavery, but individuals who expected certain standards, who knew when their treatment violated established norms, who had avenues, however, limited to seek redress. As the workday ends, a particular quality of silence falls across the Giza plateau. The limestone blocks, still holding the day's heat, release it slowly into the cooling desert air. Cooking fires flicker across the worker village as the massive, unfinished pyramid casts its lengthening shadow. The laborers, exhausted yet sustained by the knowledge that they build something approaching immortality, settle into the brief respite before dawn brings another day of toil. Their contribution, whether given willingly, reluctantly, or through various forms of coercion would stand for thousands of years, their individual stories largely forgotten, until archaeologists began carefully piecing together the true narrative of how the pyramids rose from the desert floor. They trudged across dusty plains, hundreds of them bound at the wrists with rough hemp rope. The Battle of Kadesh had ended days ago, but for these captives, the true defeat was just beginning. Egyptian soldiers prodded stragglers with spear butts, their shadows stretching long across the landscape as the sun descended. These weren't merely prisoners of war, they were now property, human chattel to be marched back to the Nile Valley and distributed as rewards to temples, noblemen, and royal estates. In these centuries, when the Hittite Empire and New Kingdom Egypt vied for supremacy across the Near East, warfare wasn't just about territorial control, it was about resource acquisition, and among the most valuable resources were human beings. After major battles like Kadesh, thousands would find themselves torn from homeland and family, facing transportation to foreign lands where even their language would be useless to them. The treaties between these Bronze Age superpowers formalized this human exchange. Clay tablets preserved in royal archives document the careful diplomacy. The great king of Hatti and the great king of Egypt shall return fugitive skilled workers who flee across borders. These weren't requests but binding international agreements, creating legal frameworks for the recapture of escaped slaves and the exchange of skilled captives. For many, their value lay in specialized knowledge. A captured metalworker from Mitanni might find himself in a Hittite forge, forever crafting weapons for the very empire that had destroyed his home. His children, born into this new reality, would inherit not just his skills but his status, generations of expertise trapped in generational bondage. Inside the sprawling textile workshops of Pi-Ramesses, dozens of women bent over looms, fingers moving in the practiced rhythms they'd performed since childhood. Most were captives from Nubian and Levantine campaigns, working from sunrise until their eyes could no longer distinguish thread colors in the dim evening light. The finest cloth they produced would never touch their bodies, reserved for temple statues, royalty, and the nobility who owned their labor. Their own garments were rough, minimal coverings that marked their status as clearly as the property marks some bore on their shoulders. Children captured in warfare faced uncertain fates. The youngest might be raised in their captors' households, gradually losing memories of their original language and culture. By adolescence, many wouldn't remember their birth parents or homeland. Boys with physical promise were often sent to the stables or assigned to military households, where they might eventually serve as auxiliary troops for the very army that had enslaved their parents. The most fortunate might become trusted household servants. The least fortunate faced crushing labor in quarries or mines, where lifespans could be measured in months rather than years. Our knowledge of these lives comes largely from unexpected sources. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and its neighbors, mention slaves primarily as gifts exchanged between rulers. A message from the king of Babylon to Pharaoh Amenhotep III requests gold while offering 20 beautiful women as partial payment. These clay tablets, unbaked until fires destroyed the archives that housed them, preserved the casual commodification of human lives in royal correspondence. Archaeological evidence tells us more. Slave quarters identified at various sites, distinctive burial treatments, and tools designed for workers with minimal training. Their lives left traces in the material record even when their names went unrecorded by history. As night fell across the Anatolian highlands, captives from a dozen different homelands huddled near small, controlled fires. Guards watched lazily, knowing that escape into unfamiliar territory meant almost certain death. Under star patterns that looked strange to many of them, they whispered stories of their homelands in languages their captors couldn't understand. These quiet moments of shared memory and mutual comfort created tiny spaces of resistance within their captivity, fleeting moments when, despite everything taken from them, they remained more than property. Tomorrow would bring another day of labor, but tonight, beneath the vast Anatolian sky, they remembered who they had been. As the sacred waters of the Ganges flowed through the heart of ancient India, they witnessed a society whose hierarchy was as stratified as the sediment layers they deposited along their banks. Between 1500 BCE and 300 BCE, the concept of servitude evolved across the Vedic and Mauryan periods, creating complex systems of bondage that differed significantly from chattel slavery seen elsewhere. The earliest Vedic texts speak of the Sa, originally referring to conquered indigenous peoples rather than purchased property. These early texts describe them with darker skin, different speech, and flat noses, revealing how servitude became entangled with ethnic differences. As centuries passed, the term Sa transformed from an ethnic designation to denote any person in bondage, regardless of origin. Meanwhile, the Dra emerged as the lowest of the four Varnas or social classes, distinct from slaves yet bound to service the three twice-born classes above them. Unlike slaves in Rome or Greece, the Indian household servant often maintained family connections. A typical SA might wake before dawn in a small back room of their master's mud brick home, sharing cramped quarters with several others. They would sleep on reed mats, perhaps with a rough cotton blanket during cooler months. Their personal possessions amounted to little: a clay cup, perhaps a wooden comb, possibly a cherished amulet passed down through generations. When Chandragupta Maurya unified northern India around 322 BCE, his advisor Chanakya codified existing practices into the Artha Stra, arguably history's most detailed ancient manual on governance, including the management of bound labor. This text reveals how thoroughly regulated a slave's existence became. A person might enter servitude through 7 recognized paths: being born to enslaved parents, being purchased, being captured in war, entering bondage voluntarily during famine, offering oneself as collateral for debt, being punished for crimes, or through judicial decree. The Artha Stra details precise regulations for punishment, prohibiting masters from striking slaves on sensitive body parts or employing excessive force. Female slaves could not be forcibly stripped, sexually exploited against their will, or made to stand in immodest positions. These protections, while limited by modern standards, offered more legal recognition than many contemporaneous societies provided. Equally significant were the 7 paths to freedom the text outlined. Slaves could purchase their liberty with earned wages, be released for extraordinary service, be freed through adoption, marriage, or religious conversion. Some gained freedom through royal decree during celebrations or following their master's death according to final wishes. For those working on the vast Mauryan state farms, life followed the rhythm of seasons. Rising before dawn, these laborers might tend rice paddies stretching toward the horizon. State-owned slaves, unlike their privately owned counterparts, lived in dedicated compounds under the watchful eyes of royal overseers. Their days consisted of back-breaking work under the Indian sun, ploughing, planting, weeding, irrigating, and harvesting crops that would supply the empire's garrisons and urban centers. Evening brought temporary respite as workers gathered around cooking fires, sharing simple meals of rice gruel, perhaps flavored with foraged greens or, on rare occasions, small portions of lentils. Despite the hardships, community formed within these bonds of shared circumstance. Children born into servitude played together in the dust while their parents worked, gradually learning the skills they would inherit. During religious festivals, the usual boundaries temporarily relaxed. Slaves participated in celebrations, singing devotional songs and sometimes even sharing food with their masters. The melancholic tunes that drifted through these compounds contained coded meanings, expressions of sorrow, hope, and resistance, understood only by those who shared their condition. These musical traditions preserved cultural memories across generations, becoming one of the few possessions that couldn't be taken away. Such was the existence of the bound in ancient India, a paradoxical life where religious texts proclaimed all souls equal while maintaining strict social hierarchies in the material world. Neither completely without rights nor truly free, these individuals navigated an existence where liberation remained a distant but not impossible dream, their humanity simultaneously recognized and constrained by the society that bound them. As the golden age of Han China flourished, its grand estates concealed a shadow economy of human bondage. Beyond the lacquered doors and jade ornaments, thousands of house slaves moved like ghosts through the sprawling mansions of the scholar gentry elite. These nubi, as they were known, comprised nearly a third of all households in certain provincescent witnesses to the empire's hidden history. Most never chose this fate. Border conflicts with the nomadic Xiongnu people to the north often ended with captives marched hundreds of miles to auction blocks in Chang'an, the imperial capital. A woman from a frontier village might be herding goats one week, then scrubbing floors in a nobleman's courtyard the next. Others slipped into slavery through crushing debt families selling daughters and sons when harvests failed or taxes came due. Some merchants even specialized in collecting these living collateral from desperate farmers across the countryside. Perhaps most feared was penal enslavement. The courts could condemn not just criminals but their entire families to hereditary servitude. One careless word against a local official might doom not only yourself but your children and grandchildren to generations of bondage. The Han legal code recognized these people as property, not persons to be bought, sold, gifted, or inherited alongside furniture and livestock. Within wealthy households, slaves performed specialized tasks according to their skills and the household's needs. In the women's quarters, female slaves prepared exquisite silk threads, drawing filaments from steaming cocoon baths with practiced fingers. The finest among them might be selected to teach noble daughters embroidery techniques or to dress their mistresses' elaborate hairstyles. Male house slaves maintained gardens, copied manuscripts, or served as tutors for young boys learning their first characters. Some exceptionally educated slaves even managed household accounts or served as scribes for their scholar masters. Change came slowly under Emperor Wen's reforms around 179 BCE. Though himself surrounded by thousands of palace slaves, the emperor was troubled by reports of cruelty. His edicts prohibited the worst abuses. Masters could no longer kill slaves without facing punishment, and children born to slave women were granted slightly improved status. Yet these paper protections meant little in the privacy of household compounds. Many slaves lived entire lives without venturing beyond their master's walls, their existence confined to whispered conversations between chores. Night brought rare moments of respite. When noble families retired, slaves gathered in kitchen corners or servant quarters, sharing stories from distant homelands many would never see again. Oil lamps cast long shadows across sleeping mats crowded together on hard floors. The soft melancholy of zither music might drift from the main house, where perhaps another slave played for the master's evening entertainment. Some found comfort in secret shrine offerings or in quiet solidarity with fellow servants. Others plotted escape, though success stories were rare and punishments severe. Morning always came too soon. Before dawn touched the tile rooftops, house slaves were already awake stoking kitchen fires, warming water for their owner's morning tea, preparing for another day of invisible existence. They moved through grand halls like shadows present enough to serve, absent enough to be forgotten. In the mosaic of Han Dynasty splendor, they were the carefully hidden cracks, bearing the weight of an empire's prosperity on bent backs and calloused hands. The mountains of Messenia stood silent witnesses to a transformation that would echo through centuries. Around 700 BCE, the warriors of Sparta, after decades of brutal warfare, conquered their neighbors to the west. The defeated Messenians weren't merely subjugated, they were systematically reduced to a unique form of servitude known as helatry. Unlike chattel slaves traded in markets, these helots remained on their ancestral lands, bound not to individual masters but to the Spartan state itself. Each year, as summer heat gave way to autumn's cooler embrace, the Spartan forced those 5 magistrates who held such sway would formally declare war on the helot population. This wasn't merely symbolic. It authorized a terrifying practice known as the Crypteia, where young Spartan men in their final stage of military training would slip into the countryside under cover of darkness. Their mission was chillingly simple: to kill any helot found walking the roads after sunset or those deemed potentially troublesome. The strongest, most spirited helots, those who might organize resistance, would mysteriously disappear, their absence a warning to others who might harbor similar thoughts. The rhythm of helot life followed the seasons of agriculture. Each family worked their assigned plot, not for themselves, but to meet the unyielding quotas imposed by their Spartan overlords. Half of everything they harvested: the golden wheat, the purple-black olives, the sweet figs that grew in such abundance, was surrendered as tribute. To deliver anything less invited, punishment so severe that few risked the consequences. Yet within this seemingly hopeless existence bloomed tiny seeds of resistance. When night fell and no Spartan ears could hear, the Helots would sometimes gather in hidden glades to sing songs of remembrance melodies that preserved the memory of Messenian freedom. These songs, passed from parent to child in whispers, maintained cultural identity when all other expressions were forbidden. The Helots developed their own dialect, subtle differences in speech that marked conversations as private, creating spaces where Spartan domination couldn't fully reach. Small acts of defiance, nearly invisible, yet vital to surviving with dignity under the crushing weight of subjugation. The life of a Helot stood in stark contrast to the experiences of those enslaved in Athens and other Greek city-states. While no slavery can be called gentle, the household slaves of Athens often lived under somewhat less severe conditions. Some were trusted with business affairs or the education of children. A fortunate few might eventually purchase their freedom through skills like pottery or metalworking. The Athenian slave could, at least theoretically, look forward to potential manumission, a prospect virtually non-existent for the Helots, who were bound to their status across generations with almost no hope of escape. As twilight settles over the slopes of Mount Taygetus, the natural boundary between Sparta and Messenia, the cicadas begin their nightly chorus. Their rhythmic humming fills the cooling air, a sound unchanged since ancient times. In small stone huts scattered across the fertile valleys, Helot families gather close, their day's labor complete. Lamps flicker with precious olive oil, casting long shadows across weathered faces. Outside, the darkness holds dangerous the silent footfalls of Crypteia youths perhaps, moving like ghosts between the silver-leafed olive trees. Inside, a grandfather might whisper stories of ancestors who lived free upon this same land. Children listen, eyes heavy with sleep, yet minds alert to lessons that won't be forgotten. This quiet resistance, this preservation of memory and identity in the face of systematic dehumanization, represents perhaps the most profound form of courage. As the cicada songs reach their crescendo and then gradually fade into night's deepest hours, the Helots find momentary peace in dreams that no Spartan sword can ever reach. In the shadow of Athens' golden age, beneath the soil where philosophers strolled and democracy bloomed, a different world existed. The silver mines of Laurium, some 25 miles south of the Acropolis, were the hidden foundation upon which Athenian greatness was built. But greatness for some meant darkness for others. The mines operated through an elaborate leasing system. Wealthy Athenian citizens would purchase concessions from the state, acquiring the right to mine a specific section for a period of years. But these citizens rarely descended into the earth themselves. Instead, they purchased or rented slaves, sometimes hundreds per operation, who would never see the light of democratic ideals that shone so brightly above. Imagine yourself as one such worker. Your day begins before dawn, as you're led with dozens of others to the mine entrance. The shaft you'll descend is barely wider than your shoulders. You've been given a small clay lamp filled with olive oil, its flickering flame your only companion in the darkness that awaits. The wick will burn for 8 hours, your timekeeper in a world without sun. Down you go, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surface, crawling through passages not tall enough to stand in. The air grows thinner, heavier with dust. Your tools are simply an iron pick, a wooden mallet, perhaps a bronze chisel if your overseer is generous. The rock is hard, unyielding. Each strike echoes in the cramped space, joining the chorus of countless other picks wielded by hands you cannot see. Water seeps from the walls, mixing with your sweat. In summer, the mines are suffocating. In winter, the dampness chills to the bone. Yet the work never ceases, for Athens has an insatiable appetite for silver. This silver, extracted from your suffering, fuels an empire. Each year, the mines yield perhaps 25 tons of the precious metal. The coins struck from it, the famous owls bearing Athena's symbol finance, the mighty trireme fleet that guards Athenian shipping lanes and projects power throughout the Aegean. The same silver pays for the grand temples being built on the Acropolis, for the festivals and public works that make Athens the envy of the Greek world. The silver you extract today might tomorrow pay the wages of the very citizens who gather in the assembly to celebrate their democratic freedom. The irony is not lost on you, though you have no voice to speak it. Some slaves in the mines are prisoners of war, others criminals, many purchased from foreign markets. Greek, Thracian, Syrian, Egyptianal are equal in the darkness. Some are worked until death. Others might serve for a decade or more. A few very few might see freedom again. After the naval battle of Arginusae in 406 BCE, something remarkable happened. Athens, desperate for rowers for its depleted fleet, instituted a rare manumission lottery. Certain mining slaves were given a chance at freedom in exchange for service on the warships. Few understood the cruel irony trading the slow death of the mines for the quick death of naval combat. Yet many seized this chance, preferring to die as men rowing under open skies than as tools in the darkness. For most, though, there is only the quiet rhythm of the mines. Pick strikes stone, stone yields silver, silver builds empire. And somewhere far above, philosophers debate the nature of justice while standing on foundations built by those who will never know it. In the darkness, you pause to trim your lamp's wick as it gutters. The flame steadies, casting strange shadows on the rock face before you. For a moment, there is silence, a rare thing in the mines. You hear only your own breathing, the distant drip of water, and deeper still, the soft echo of countless pickaxes striking in unison, a heartbeat of silver flowing through Athens' veins. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after. Until the silver runs out, or you do. As the sun rises over the rolling hills of Sicily, thousands of human bodies stir from their brief respite. The year is 167 BCE, and Rome's victory in the Third Punic War has flooded the Italian peninsula with a new commodity: people. Not citizens, not freedmen, but captives of worn-out slaves to work the vast agricultural estates known as latifundia that sprawl across the fertile landscapes of Sicily and southern Italy. These estates are not the small family farms of Rome's nostalgic past. They are industrial operations, agricultural factories stretching across thousands of acres, owned by absent senators and equestrians who may visit once a year, if at all. The latifundia represent a new economic reality: mass production of olive oil, wine, and grain, using an endless supply of human labor acquired through conquest. You are one of these bodies. Perhaps you were a farmer in North Africa, a craftsman in Greece, or a shepherd in Hispania. Your origins no longer matter. What matters is your strength, your endurance, your ability to survive. Dawn brings the overseer's bell, its hollow clanging cutting through morning mist. The sound means movement, not awakening few truly sleep in the crowded, lice-infested barracks where hundreds are chained together through the night. The iron collar around your neck has rubbed your skin raw over months, but the pain has become familiar, almost unnoticeable compared to newer agonies. You shuffle into formation with others bearing the same mark branded onto your forehead, the mark of your master's family. The brands serve both as ownership claim and shame, ensuring that even if you somehow escaped, your status would be immediately visible to any who saw you. The overseer, himself a slave though privileged, carries his vine staff, the symbol of his authority and the instrument of immediate punishment for any perceived slowness. The task gang system governs your existence. 20 people chained together move as one into the fields. There is no conversation, only the rhythmic scrape of tools against earth and the occasional crack of the whip against exposed skin. The sun climbs higher, its heat intensifying. Water comes rarely a single cup at midday, often stagnant, sometimes mixed with sour wine if the harvest has been good. Food is simpler still, a handful of grain boiled into porridge, occasionally supplemented with olive oil if the season has been productive. Your body bears witness to this life. Your hands have long since hardened into calloused tools themselves. Your back carries a lattice of scars from whippings. Your legs show the friction marks of chains. At night, you sometimes dream of your homeland, but those images grow fainter with each passing season. Some around you have forgotten their native tongues entirely, communication reduced to a crude mixture of Latin and Greek phrases necessary for survival. Far to the east of your field, whispers occasionally reach even the most isolated latifundia. Stories of a man named Yunus in eastern Sicily, a Syrian slave who claims divine inspiration, who gathers followers and speaks of resistance. The overseers beat anyone caught sharing such tales, but they spread nonetheless, carried in hushed tones between work gangs, passed along supply routes by slave traders themselves. Few believe anything will come of these rumors. Revolts have happened before, always ending in mass crucifixions along the Appian Way. 70 years later, another name will cause even Roman senators to tremble, Spartacusput, that future rebellion remains unwritten. For now, there is only the endless present, the field, the task, the gang, the overseer, the bell. As evening approaches, the western sky blazes orange and purple across the vineyard hills. The bell rings again, signaling the return to shelter-simple lean-tos for field slaves like yourself, the vine-covered structures offering minimal protection from the elements. This is the day's sole mercy, a few hours of relative stillness before tomorrow repeats the cycle. The overseers distribute the evening meal, a slightly larger portion of porridge with perhaps an onion or garlic clove if the master is feeling generous. On rare occasions, slaves share the watered wine that you yourselves have produced from these very vines. The taste is sharp and diluted, nothing like what graces the master's table, but it dulls the constant ache in your joints and back, if only briefly. Around you, other slaves settle into the rhythm of evening. An old Carthaginian woman hums a melody from a homeland she'll never see again. Two Greek brothers whisper to each other in their native dialect, preserving memories of a shared childhood. A young Iberian girl, recently arrived, silently weeps until exhaustion claims her. The villa slaves' house servants who enjoy marginally better conditions are nowhere to be seen, separated physically and socially from field workers. As darkness falls completely, conversation dwindles. Bodies shift on hard-packed dirt floors, seeking comfort where none exists. Tomorrow will bring the same bell, the same fields, the same overseer with his vine staff. For most, this existence will continue until death provides the only escape from the latifundia. But even in this darkest moment of Roman slavery, embers of resistance smolder beneath the surface, waiting for the winds of opportunity to fan them into flames. The streets of imperial Rome fall quiet as evening descends, but within the domus of Senator Gaius Petronius Maximus, shadows still move across frescoed walls. The urban service, house slaves, perform their final duties before the household settles for the night. Their existence forms an invisible architecture supporting every aspect of elite Roman life. Unlike their counterparts laboring in mines or fields, these domestic slaves inhabit a complex social ecosystem within the domus walls. A strict hierarchy governs their relationships, with status determined not by birth but by proximity to power and demonstrated loyalty. At the pinnacle stands the dispensator, the household treasurer who manages accounts and holds keys to storage rooms where olive oil and wine age in terracotta vessels. Below him, the atriensis oversees daily operations, assigning tasks and mediating disputes between slaves with the weary patience of one who must answer to the master for every imperfection. Among the most educated stands the pedagogus, often a Greek slave responsible for teaching the master's children. With salt and pepper beard and ink-stained fingers, he recites Homer and corrects Latin declensions until his young charge's eyes grow heavy. His position grants him authority to strike noble-born children for poor performance, a power that must be wielded with caution, as the master's favor can transform into punishment with alarming speed. In the Colina, kitchen slaves prepare tomorrow's bread before dawn breaks. Their hands are calloused from grinding grain and tending fires. The youngest learn by watching, advancing from cleaning fish and plucking fowl to eventually mastering the complex sauces that distinguish refined Roman dining. The head cook might own several recipe scrolls, treasured possessions earned through years of service. His knowledge of garum fermentation and honey wine reductions makes him valuable enough to avoid the constant threat of sale that hangs over less skilled servants. The domus scribes maintain correspondence and financial records, their literacy setting them apart from most Romans, slave or free. Some accompany their master to the forum, recording business transactions or political conversations in wax tablets with swift, practiced strokes. Their ability to remember conversations accurately often proves more valuable than their writing. Trust forms the invisible currency within this world. A trusted body slave might dress his master, handle jewelry worth more than the slave's own market value, even prepare medicines or intimate meals. Others remain forever at the periphery, nameless figures who empty chamber pots and scrub floor tiles with pumice. They move through rooms with downcast eyes, trained to become invisible when important visitors arrive. For most, hope centers on the peculium, the small savings a benevolent master might allow a slave to accumulate. Unlike their own bodies, these meager coins legally belong to them. A skilled cook might earn tips from satisfied dinner guests. A literate slave might copy manuscripts in precious spare moments. These savings, sometimes supplemented by a master's occasional generosity, grow slowly inside clay pots hidden beneath sleeping pallets or entrusted to temple safekeeping. The peculium represents more than money. It embodies the distant possibility of the Sina Libera, the freedom ceremony. Those fortunate enough to purchase their liberty would wear the felt cap of the freedman and receive a symbolic slap from their former master before enjoying a celebratory meal. The price of freedom varies wildly. An aging household slave might require a modest sum, while a valued secretary or physician might need decades to save the required amount. Many never achieve this dream, instead passing their peculium to children born into servitude, extending hope to the next generation. The satirist Petronius captures their reality in his Satyricon, describing a household slave named Giton who had become so thoroughly domesticated that he would have accepted any degradation. Martial's epigrams reveal crueler truths of masters who demand slaves stand motionless, as living lamp holders during night-long banquets, their arms aching and wax burning their skin. His verses mock a master who counts olives to ensure servants don't steal food, and another who forces an elderly slave to swim ahead of his boat to test for currents. These literary portraits illuminate what legal documents cannot, the psychological toll of existing as human property. Urban slaves might wear finer clothes and eat better food than rural counterparts or even poor freemen, yet remain fundamentally objects whose purpose centers on enhancing their owner's comfort and status. As midnight approaches in the senator's domus, the marble atrium finally falls silent. The last oil lamps flicker out as slaves settle onto thin pallets in cramped cellae near the kitchen or beneath stairwells. Their footfalls echo briefly across mosaic floors depicting scenes from mythology, heroes and gods, whose freedom they can only witness, never experience. Tomorrow before dawn, they will rise again, resuming their perpetual orbit around the master's needs, their own existence measured not in personal aspirations, but in tasks completed without notice or complaint. The stone corridors beneath the great arena fall silent as dusk creeps across imperial Rome. Here, in the Ludus, the gladiatorial schoolmen from every corner of the empire prepare for tomorrow's games. Some arrived in chains, captured in distant campaigns against Thracian rebels or Gallic insurgents. One does not choose to become a gladiator, the empire chooses for you. A Numidian prisoner of war sleeps fitfully near the wall, his dreams still filled with the taste of desert air and freedom. Beside him rests a former thief, condemned to the arena for stealing from a senator's villa. His sentence, commuted from death to something the Romans consider more merciful, a chance to die fighting. Not all came unwillingly. The Auctorati volunteers signed away their bodies and futures on small wax tablets, trading citizen rights for the promise of glory. A bankrupt merchant from Ostia, a disgraced legionary, a farmer's son seeking fortune each pledged their oath before a magistrate. I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Their payment for this terrible promise, food, training, and the faint hope that crowds might someday chant their names. As torches flicker along the walls, slaves distribute the evening meal. Better fare than common laborers receive gladiators of valuable investments. Barley porridge thickened with beans forms their daily staple, supplemented with dried figs and oil-drizzled bread. Occasionally, chunks of fatty meat appear in wooden bowls. The Lannister, the trainer and owner, refers to this diet as building flesh for the sword. Some new recruits joke nervously that they're being fattened like market hogs, but the veterans eat silently, knowing that this high-calorie meal builds the necessary padding beneath their skin padding that might stop a blade from finding vital organs tomorrow. The ludus medicus passes between the long tables, checking wounds from the day's training. Skilled in the arts of Hippocrates and Galen, these physicians represent the Empire's finest medical knowledge applied to its strangest purpose, keeping men healthy enough to risk death again. A cauterizing iron glows orange as he closes a gash on Retiarius's shoulder-nose stitches for deep wounds, as infection kills more surely than steel. The injured man barely flinches. Pain becomes familiar in this life. Strange brotherhoods form in these shadowed halls. Men who might kill each other tomorrow share wine and stories tonight. A grizzled Samnite fighter demonstrates sword technique to a novice, his rough hands guiding the younger man's wrist. "Keep your shield tight against your body," he murmurs, "or my trident will find your liver." They laugh together, though both understand the deadly seriousness beneath the instruction. Such bonds confuse outsider show. Can men facing mutual slaughter form friendships? Yet here, only fellow gladiators truly understand the weight each carries. Deeper into the night, as oil lamps burn low, murmured prayers rise from pallets. Invocations to Fortuna, to Hercules, to foreign gods smuggled in from distant homelands. A Thracian clutches a small wooden horse, whispering in his native tongue. Death hovers perpetually close in the ludus, and every man seeks whatever divine favor might be granted. Some prostrate themselves before small shrines to Nemesis goddess of fate's balance, hoping tomorrow's scales might tip in their favor. The most veteran fighters run calloused fingers over wooden practice swords, their movements contemplative in the candlelight. Each has fought dozens, perhaps hundreds of matches. Each bears scars that tell stories of narrow survival. They know what spectators cannot understand, that freedom remains possible. The Rudeza wooden sword granted to exceptional gladiators represents release from this life of controlled violence. A few grey-bearded men in the corner were once arena combatants themselves, now trainers who earned their liberty through years of survival and crowd adulation. As midnight approaches, silence finally descends. Tomorrow the sand will drink blood beneath a merciless sun and 20,000 roaring voices. But tonight, in these cool underground chambers, gladiators rest in the strange peace that comes to those who have surrendered everything except the next heartbeat, the next breath, the next chance to live just one more day. The longships appeared on the horizon at dawn, their dragon-headed prows cutting through Baltic mist like spectres. For the women of coastal villages from the British Isles to the Baltic shores, these silhouettes brought a singular terror. The Viking raid was not merely about plunder, it was about people. While men were often killed in these violent incursions, women and children were valuable cargo to be taken alive, bound in ropes, and loaded onto ships. These captives became thralls. The Old Norse word for slaves and bondswomen formed the silent backbone of Norse households across Scandinavia. Their lives narrowed to the confines of farmsteads and longhouses, where labor divided sharply along gender lines. While male thralls worked fields and tended livestock, women were confined to indoor tasks that both exploited and erased their presence. In buildings called weaving barns, thrall women spent endless hours at looms, their fingers working wool and flax into the textiles that clothed entire households. The repetitive click of the loom beater became the metronome of their existence. A skilled thrall weaver might produce nearly 30 feet of woolen cloth in a week, her expertise valued, yet her personhood denied. These women ground flour between heavy stones until their backs curved permanently toward the earth. They prepared meals, nursed their mistresses' children alongside or instead of their own, and served food at feasts where they remained peripheral shadows, visible yet unseen. The silver dirham, gleaming with Arabic script, became the currency that determined a thrall woman's worth. These Islamic coins flowed northward through Russian river routes, filling the purses of slave traders who assessed women with calculating eyes. Young women from Slavic territories commanded the highest prices. The very word slave derives from Slav, a linguistic echo of this brutal commerce. Beauty was quantifiable, virginity negotiable, and strength measurable in the merchant's dispassionate gaze. At the slave markets of Dublin, established by Norse settlers in Ireland, human merchandise stood in rows along wooden platforms. Here, potential buyers examined teeth and limbs, speaking of those before them as though discussing horses or cattle. A woman might sell for 8 to 12 ounces of silver enough to purchase 60 milk cows. For wealthy Norse households, owning several thrall women displayed prosperity as visibly as gold arm rings or imported silk. Children born to these women inherited their mother's status, creating generations who never knew freedom, their lineage bound to service by birth rather than capture. Archaeological discoveries tell stories that written records do not. In quiet burial grounds across Scandinavia, excavations have revealed the bodies of thrall women buried alongside their mistresses not as equals in death, but as possessions meant to serve in the afterlife. At Gerdrup in Denmark, a female slave was found with her neck broken, sacrificed to accompany her mistress beyond the grave. In a burial at Flakstad in Norway, a thrall girl of perhaps 16 summers lay crumpled at her owner's feet, her skeleton bearing signs of malnutrition and heavy labor despite her youth. These silent bones speak of lives cut short, of personhood denied, even in final rest. As darkness descended on Norse farmsteads, the northern light sometimes painted the sky in shifting curtains of green and violet. Inside longhouses, free families gathered around central hearths while thrall women moved quietly through shadows, banking fires and preparing sleeping areas. When their labors finally ceased deep in the night, they retired to sleeping platforms near doorways, the coldest, most exposed positions to outbuildings where they found brief respite. Under the aurora's ethereal light, some perhaps whispered prayers to forgotten gods of homelands they would never see again. Others taught daughters born into bondage fragments of languages and customs from places beyond the sea, cultural memories preserved in whispers beneath woolen blankets as the northern lights danced overhead, indifferent to the boundaries humans drew between freedom and bondage. The morning frost crunches beneath bare feet as they make their way across the frozen field. A serf's day begins before the sun rises. It has always been this way for their father, their grandfather, and will be for their children. This is the curious paradox of 12th century serfdom, bound to the land through generations, yet never truly owning a handful of the soil they worked upon. Medieval European serfdom existed in this peculiar limbo. Unlike chattel slavery, where humans were property outright, serfs were technically considered Christian souls, possessing certain theoretical rights under God. The Church, while endorsing the three-tiered social order of those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, maintained that all were children of the same Creator. Yet this theological nicety rarely improved daily life. A serf was bound to their lord's land through an invisible chain of hereditary obligation that stretched back through centuries. You weren't bought and sold like cattle at market, but you couldn't simply pack up and leave either. You were inherited along with the fields when estates changed hands. Your marriage required permission. Your children inherited your status automatically at birth. The Lord could demand a portion of your daughter's dowry or your son's inheritance. This paradox created a strange half-freedom, not property in name, yet treated as such in practice. The rhythm of life followed an endless repetition of obligations. Monday through Wednesday, you worked your own strips of land, scattered inefficiently throughout the open fields. Thursday, Friday, and often Saturday belonged to the Lord, ploughing his domain fields, repairing his roads, maintaining his mill. Every moment of light was precious. A good harvest might mean survival, a poor one guaranteed hunger by spring. Your tools remained simple wooden plows that barely scratched the heavy soil, hand sickles that made harvesting painfully slow, flails that required countless hours to separate grain from chaff. The calendar was punctuated not by weekends but by saints' days, small mercies that broke the endless cycle of toil. Planting had its rituals, harvest its festivals. Martinmas, Michaelmas, Christmas, Easter, each brought brief respite and communal celebration. The parish priest marked these rhythms, collecting his own tithe while reminding you that humble service was God's will. 1 day in 10 belonged to the Church as surely as 3 days in 7 belonged to your Lord. Yet medieval Europe held something previous, Slave societies lacked cracks in the system through which freedom might be grasped. The old Roman saying whispered, "Town air makes free." After a year and a day within a chartered town's walls, a runaway serf might claim liberty. These towns grew like islands of possibility in the feudal landscape. Merchants, craftsmen, and escaped serfs formed new communities governed by charters rather than manorial custom. Some lords, perpetually short of coin, sold freedom outright. Others granted it in their wills, as acts of Christian charity to ease their passage to heaven. Wars, crusades, and plagues periodically created labor shortages that strengthened the serf's bargaining position. Clever families might save for generations to purchase manumission. Others simply fled under cover of night, disappearing into the forests or distant towns, gambling everything on not being caught and dragged back in chains. By the late 12th century, parchment charters began replacing verbal traditions. Village communities collectively negotiated written agreements, specifying exactly what they owed, fixing obligations that lords had previously increased at will. These documents became treasured possessions, carefully preserved as bulwarks against arbitrary demands. Long before sunrise, the bells of the monastery drift across frosted fields, penetrating the thin walls of wattle and daub cottages. Inside, families stir beneath scratchy woolen blankets. The air hangs heavy with wood smoke and the damp smell of earth. These bells mark time in a way no serf can afford to ignore, calling them to prayer, to work, to the rhythm of a life not fully their own. As the first pale light creeps across thatched roofs, another day begins in the strange half-freedom of medieval serfdom. Neither fully enslaved nor truly free, they rise to work land they will never own, beneath a sky that belongs to everyone. Imagine being taken from your family at age 7 or 8, not to labor in fields or serve in a household, but to one day wield power that could reshape empires. This was the peculiar destiny of many Turkic boys swept into the Islamic world's most unusual institution of slavery, the Malm, Kay, and Ghul, Minya systems. Unlike any other form of slavery we've explored, these boys were acquired specifically for military service. Their very name Mammal, Kay, means one who is owned in Arabic. But ownership here followed a different path. Their masters were caliphs and sultans who saw in these foreign youths the makings of the most loyal fighting force in medieval Islam. The story typically began in the steppes of Central Asia. Turkic tribes, renowned for horsemanship, produced boys who were either purchased or captured in raids. Merchants would transport them across vast distances to markets in Baghdad, Damascus, or Cairo. There, agents of the Sultanate would examine them carefully, looking not for strong backs, but for intelligence, physical promise, and the absence of family ties that might compete with loyalty to their new masters. Upon arrival in Cairo, these boys entered a world both privileged and demanding. The barracks became their home, the training ground their school. Dawn would find them already mounted, learning to shoot arrows from horseback at full gallop, a skill requiring years to perfect. By midday, they practiced swordsmanship, their instructors barking commands in Turkish before they gradually learned Arabic. Afternoons brought Islamic religious instruction, for these pagan boys would be converted and taught that serving their master was serving Allah. The intensity of their training was unmatched. While other slaves across the world might face back-breaking labor, these boys faced bone-breaking discipline. A missed arrow shot might earn 20 lashes. Yet unlike field slaves elsewhere, they ate well, slept in decent quarters, and knew that excellence meant advancement. Perhaps strangest of all, these slave soldiers could rise to unimaginable heights. By the mid-13th century, the Mammal, Kays, had gone from servants to masters, establishing their own sultanate that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Former slaves became sultans, commanding armies and building architectural marvels that still define Cairo's skyline today. Court etiquette developed its own bizarre contradictions. A Mammal, Kay, who rose to become an emir or sultan, still maintained formal ties to his former master or that master's descendants. In elaborate ceremonies, these powerful men would symbolically demonstrate submission to those who had once owned them, even while commanding thousands of their own Mammal KS. The social complexity extended beyond military ranks. While Mammal KS dominated the ruling elite, a completely separate class of slaves existed in the same households, the Abd, primarily Africans who served domestic functions. The contrast was stark. The Turkic mammal, K, might dine with his master and eventually earn freedom and position. The African servant might spend a lifetime carrying water and cleaning stables, with little hope of advancement. This stratification created a society where skin color, origin, and function created distinct hierarchies even within slavery itself. A Marmel, K commander, might own dozens of African slaves while technically remaining a slave himself, a concept almost impossible to reconcile with slavery as practiced in Rome, the Americas, or ancient China. As evening falls across Cairo, picture the citadel, that massive fortress overlooking the city. The drums that had punctuated the day's training sessions gradually fall silent. The call to prayer echoes across the courtyards. In their quarters, exhausted young Mummel, KS listen to older soldiers tell tales of battle and glory. Some will die in training, others in battle, but a few might one day climb the steps to the Sultan's chamber not as servants, but as rulers. In the strange world of Islamic military slavery, yesterday's captured boy could be tomorrow's conqueror. The quiet waters surrounding Madeira and São Tomé belied the revolution that would reshape human history. These modest Atlantic islands, Portuguese outposts scattered like afterthoughts in the vast ocean, became the unexpected crucible where modern plantation slavery was first forged. Before the Americas became synonymous with the brutal institution, these volcanic territories served as laboratories where Europeans refined techniques that would eventually condemn millions. The verdant slopes of Madeira, with its temperate climate, and the equatorial lowlands of São Tomé, where rain fell in sheets through humid air, provided ideal conditions for sugarcane. Here, in the 15th century, Europeans devised production systems requiring intensive labor that local populations would not provide. The solution came in human cargo, the first African captives transported specifically to work European-owned plantations, establishing a terrible precedent that would echo for centuries. The heart of these plantations was the sugar mill, where life revolved around the relentless rotation of massive wooden presses. The creak and groan of these mechanisms kept time like a metronome governing all human activity within earshot. Workers fed freshly cut cane between wooden rollers, crushed by oxen plodding in endless circles, extracting sweet juice that would be boiled and crystallized into the white gold that European palates increasingly craved. The labor was dangerous. Limbs could be caught and crushed in an instant of inattention. Exhaustion was the constant companion of those who worked from dawn until the tropical sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Through this unceasing work emerged something unexpected, songs that provided both rhythm for collective labor and vessels for preserving memories of distant homelands. Low, melodic chants in Yoruba, Igbo, and other West African languages provided subtle resistance and spiritual sustenance, voices harmonizing over the mechanical chorus of squeaking wood and bubbling cane juice. The songs traveled with the workers, evolving as they moved from island to island, eventually reaching across the Atlantic to Brazil, Cuba, and beyond. Cultural DNA carried in melodies when all else was stripped away. The legal architecture of this new form of bondage emerged through contracts and agreements that history has preserved in fading ink on yellowed pages. Portuguese merchants drafted documents that spoke of terms of service and limited durations, but these papers masked a more sinister reality. The earliest agreements often specified 5 or 7-year terms of labor, suggesting temporary arrangements more akin to indenture than permanent enslavement. Yet, as the century progressed, these contracts became increasingly restrictive, with conditions that rendered freedom all but theoretical. Children born to those in bondage inherited their parents' status, creating generations who would never know liberty. These legal frameworks, developed in relative obscurity on Atlantic islands, would later be expanded and codified as chattel slavery in the Americas. The seeds planted in São Tomé's volcanic soil would bear bitter fruit across an ocean, where the documentation of human ownership would become increasingly explicit, abandoning even the thin pretense of contractual arrangements that characterized these early experiments. As evening descends over the cane fields, the ocean wind whispers through the tall leaves, creating a gentle susurration like countless small voices speaking in unison. The light takes on a golden quality, softening the harsh realities of the plantation into deceptive beauty. Workers straighten their aching backs as the day's labor concludes, muscles trembling with fatigue as they gather tools and begin the slow walk to simple dwellings clustered near the mill. The breeze carries salt and the sweet fermented scent of crushed cane, nature's perfume masking the underlying odors of sweat and toil. Shadows lengthen across rows of plants that seem to stretch into infinity, their sharp-edged leaves catching the fading light like thousands of small blades. The Atlantic itself becomes visible from higher elevations, its vast expanse, both barrier and bridge, separating the enslaved from ancestral lands, while connecting them to an emerging world of forced labor that would soon span continents. In this twilight moment, between the brutality of day and the brief respite of night, the true weight of this new system hangs suspended in the cooling air, its full implications not yet revealed, but already set irreversibly in motion. The journey across the Atlantic began as a death sentence for many. Portuguese ships, their hulls packed with human cargo, crossed from Angola and the Guinea coast to Salvador da Bahia. Below deck, men, women, and children lay chained in rows, their bodies pressed against one another in a darkness thick enough to touch. The air, heavy with the stench of human waste and disease, filled lungs already struggling from the ship's constant rocking. Those who survived the middle passage aimed, many did not emerge from the holds blinking into Brazilian sunlight, their skin rubbed raw from wooden planks and iron chains. Salvador's port buzzed with activity as new arrivals were herded onto docks. Colonial officials recorded each person as merchandise, no different from the barrels of sugar and tobacco being loaded onto outbound ships. Guards brandished whips to maintain order among the disoriented captives, many of whom had never before seen the ocean until they were forced to cross it. Their bodies, weakened by weeks of inadequate food and water, were scrubbed and oiled to appear healthier for what came next. The auction blocks of Salvador represented the final severing of ties to home. Potential buyers examined teeth, muscles, and joints with clinical detachment. Young men destined for the mines commanded the highest prices, their strength, a commodity to be exploited until it failed. Families that had somehow remained together through the voyage now witnessed their final separations. Mothers reached desperately for children, as they were sold to different masters. Husbands and wives exchanged last glances across crowded squares. Names given at birth were replaced with Portuguese ones, another step in the systematic erasure of identity. For those purchased by mine owners, another journey awaited, this time inland, toward Minas Gerais, where gold had been discovered in quantities that fed Portugal's imperial ambitions. Chained in coffles, they trudged hundreds of miles on foot through coastal lowlands and into the mountainous interior. The lucky ones rode mules, not out of mercy but because their high purchase price made them too valuable to risk losing on the journey. Guards on horseback kept constant watch, stories of the Peçonha dog strain to track and maul runaways serving as a warning against escape attempts. A tired sun bathes the Chesapeake fields in amber light, retreating below the horizon with reluctant slowness. The day's heat lingers in the soil, in the wooden fence posts, in the aching muscles of those who've toiled since before first light. Now, as darkness gathers, two different worlds emerge across these 18th century plantations. In the Chesapeake tobacco country, the task system prevails. Enslaved people have been assigned specific duties, so many plants to tend, so many leaves to harvest, so many bundles to hang in the curing barns. Complete your tasks, and the evening hours might bring small freedoms. Down in the Carolina Low Country, where rice dominates the landscape, the gang system reigns with harsher discipline. From sunup to sundown, field hands move as one unit under constant supervision, forced to match pace with the strongest among them, backs bent over flooded paddies. The tobacco barns stand like dark sentinels, their weathered boards still radiating the day's heat. Inside, thousands of tobacco leaves hang in ordered rows, slowly curing in the controlled warmth. These structures demand constant attention, fires maintained at precise temperatures, ventilation adjusted throughout the night. Someone must always watch, sleep surrendered to this vigilance. Miles away, the vast rice fields stretch toward the horizon, transformed by an intricate system of dikes, canals, and trunks that control water flow with remarkable precision. This hydraulic engineering, this knowledge of how to flood and drain fields according to the rice plant's needs, came not from European planters but from the enslaved West Africans who carried their agricultural expertise across the Atlantic. Their knowledge became the foundation of Carolina wealth, though they themselves would never benefit from the fortunes they created. Night deepens. Behind the quarters, beyond the overseer's suspicious gaze, simple structures appear in clearings, praise houses built from whatever materials could be salvaged. Inside these humble sanctuaries, spirituality blossoms in whispered prayers and quiet hymns. The white churches taught submission and obedience from their pulpits, but here, in these sacred spaces, different messages emerge, of deliverance, of eventual freedom, of divine justice. Deeper still in the woods stand the hush arbors, hidden places of worship where voices can rise without fear, where African rhythms blend with Christian hymns to create something entirely new, spirituals carrying coded meanings that pass undetected by white ears. Steal away to Jesus, not just heavenly salvation but directions for earthly escape. Wade in the water, practical advice for evading pursuit, for throwing hunting dogs off the scent. Back in the quarters, skilled hands work by the light of carefully hoarded candle stubs. A woman stitches a quilt, its pattern seemingly random but containing information about safe houses and escape routes. The North Star block points the way to freedom. The flying geese pattern indicates direction. The wagon wheel marks a point to seek transportation. These textile maps speak only to those who know how to read them. The pace of work has its own subtle language of resistance. There are 1,000 ways to appear diligent while accomplishing less, tools that mysteriously break, seeds that somehow fail to thrive, animals that inexplicably escape their pens. These small acts of defiance carry immense risk, but they preserve something essential, the knowledge that submission is external, not internal, that the spirit remains unbroken. Behind cabins, hidden gardens flourish in the summer darkness. These small plots represent precious autonomy, the right to grow food of one's choosing, to supplement the inadequate rations provided by owners. Okra, yams, collard greens, black-eyed peas, crops with African origins now taking root in American soil. Some of this produce might be sold at Sunday markets, creating a modest, precarious economic independence within the brutal system that denies all freedom. Night settles fully now across the landscape. Crickets pulse in rhythmic waves through the heavy air. River fog rises like ghostly breath from the waterways that both sustain life and serve as highways of commerce, carrying away the fruits of forced labor. In cabins, families gather in exhausted closeness, sharing stories, preserving memories of ancestral lands, passing down knowledge that owners can never possess or steal. The darkness offers momentary respite, though even sleep remains partly vigilant. Tomorrow will demand renewed strength, renewed endurance. But for now, in this brief interval between labor's end and its resumption, humanity asserts itself in quiet conversation, in tender gestures, in shared meals, in whispered prayers. Even here, even now, communities form and sustain themselves, creating connections that will outlast the chains that bind them. The haunting blare of the horn slices through the pre-dawn darkness, pulling enslaved men, women, and children from their slumber in the cramped, dirt-floored cabins of the quarters. Their day begins before the sun itself dares to rise. Even the youngest children stir at this sound, knowing its significance by instinct before they're old enough to articulate it. This horn marks the beginning of another day serving the Cotton Kingdom. The overseer's voice cuts through the morning mist as he assigns daily picking quotas. 200 pounds for most adults, 150 for the elderly and stronger children. Even pregnant women must meet their quotas, their backs bent doubly under the weight of both cotton and child. The enslaved move through the fields carrying long sacks that drag behind them, fingers working nimbly despite the cuts from the sharp cotton bolls that open like tiny mouths, revealing the white gold inside. The Mississippi summer sun bears down without mercy, turning the vast cotton fields into a shimmering sea of heat. Water breaks are few, rest is scarce. The day stretches endlessly until dusk approaches, when the final horn signals the day's picking has ended. Then comes the weighing. Each person stands silently as their day's labor is measured, knowing the consequences of falling short. Those who exceed their quotas receive no reward. Those who fail face the whip or other punishments the next morning before work begins anew. The scales do not lie, but sometimes overseers make them tell falsehoods. Despite the cruelty of their circumstances, family bonds in the quarters run deeper than any cotton route. Mothers whisper stories to their children in the precious hours between sunset and sleep. Fathers carve small wooden toys by firelight, their calloused hands creating moments of joy from scraps. Extended kinship networks form throughout the plantation, with older enslaved people adopting the orphaned or separated, ensuring no child stands completely alone. Naming traditions carry profound significance. Some children receive names from African languages, preserved through generations despite attempts to erase their heritage. Others are named after ancestors, creating living links to family histories that survive despite the auction block's constant threat of separation. Many infants receive two names, one for the master's records, and another true name spoken only among community members, a small but meaningful act of resistance. Saturday evenings bring rare moments of relative autonomy. After the half-day of work, the quarters come alive with what little energy remains. Handmade banjos and drums appear from hiding places. Feet that have shuffled through cotton rows all week now tap complex rhythms on packed earth. Voices that remain silent under the overseer's gaze rise in songs with double meanings, spirituals that speak of biblical deliverance while encoding messages about earthly escape. These gatherings become brief spaces where humanity is reclaimed, where laughter can momentarily drown out the approaching Monday horn. In hushed tones, after children sleep and away from potential informants, some speak of the Underground Railroad. Names like Harriet Tubman pass through whispers. Stories circulate of those who vanished northward, some to freedom, others to unknown fates. The slave patrols heighten tensions with their nighttime raids, hunting for runaways with their specially trained dogs. Maps exist not on paper but in memorized patterns of stars and landmarks. Directions are encoded in quilt patterns or songs. While many never attempt escape, knowing the brutal consequences of capture, the very existence of the railroad sustains a crucial ember of hope that refuses to be extinguished. As the quarters finally settle into uneasy sleep, the immense night sky stretches above the Cotton Kingdom. The same stars that guide some to freedom watch over those who remain. The sweet scent of magnolia blossoms drifts from the big house gardens, a perfume that cannot mask the underlying reality of this place. In the distance, the cotton stands sentinel in neat rows, bowls glowing faintly under moonlight, awaiting tomorrow's harvest. The same hands that pick it will never profit from it. The same backs bent beneath its weight will never be straightened by its value. Still, in dreams at least, many find temporary freedom as they rest before the dawn horn sounds once more. In the grey light of dawn, Richmond's slave pens stood like weathered tombstones along the James River, crude wooden structures with small barred windows, where human beings awaited their fate like cargo. The year is 1835, and the domestic slave trade has become America's second largest industry, behind only cotton production. These holding pens, they called them slave jails, housed men, women, and children who'd been purchased from plantations in Virginia and Maryland, states where tobacco farming had depleted the soil, making slavery less profitable than simply selling the enslaved themselves. The air inside these pens was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, waste buckets, and fear. Guards moved between the cells, checking merchandise, occasionally prodding someone with a stick to stand straighter. In the courtyards, potential buyers examined teeth, muscles, scars, evidence of punishment or resistance. The enslaved people were forced to dance, jump, demonstrate their strength. Richmond traders like Robert Lumpkin and Hector Davis became wealthy men selling human beings, their establishments earning names like the Devil's Half Acre. When enough people had been purchased, the coffles formed. Long lines of people chained together at the neck, wrist and ankle, stretching sometimes half a mile long. They marched south through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, sometimes all the way to New Orleans. The journey could take months. They walked 15, 20 miles a day, sleeping in fields or forests, always in chains. Armed men on horseback kept watch, whips and pistols ready. Those who couldn't keep pace were beaten. Those who still couldn't walk were sometimes simply abandoned to die. The coffle chains rattled with each step, a constant reminder of their captivity, a sound that haunts the American landscape to this day. Mary Armstrong, born in St. Louis, was just 7 when she was sold away from her mother. "I remember when they put me on the block," she later recalled. "I looked at the folks and wondered if anybody would buy me." Her mother wept as the auctioneer started the bidding. They never saw each other again. This scene repeated itself thousands upon thousands of times across the South. Between 1820 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were sold down the river from the upper South to the deep South, where cotton plantations demanded ever more bodies. Solomon Northup, a free black man kidnapped into slavery, wrote of witnessing a mother named Eliza being sold away from her children. "Never have I seen such an exhibition of intense, unmeasured, and unbounded grief," he recorded. The woman pleaded with her new owner to buy her children too. He refused. She clung to them until physically torn away, her screams echoing through the auction house. Her children were sold to different buyers moments later. In Richmond and Washington and Alexandria, in Charleston and Savannah, these separations happened daily. Fathers from daughters, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers. The enslaved developed a term for this particular cruelty: the weeping time. Some mothers, knowing separation was imminent, taught their children identifying marks or songs, desperate tools to perhaps find each other someday. Some, in ultimate acts of resistance and mercy, killed their infants rather than see them grow up in chains. In New Orleans, the trade reached its grotesque zenith. The markets there were sophisticated businesses, with enslaved people displayed in showrooms rather than outdoor blocks. Buyers strolled between rows of people arranged by height, age, skin tone. Light-skinned women and girls were often sold as fancy maids, a euphemism for sexual slavery. Some traders forced enslaved people to appear happy, pinching them if they didn't smile for potential buyers. At night, by candlelight, some of the enslaved managed to scratch out letters to family members left behind. Most couldn't write, but those who could sometimes sent messages through sympathetic travelers or free black sailors. "Dear wife." One such letter begins, "I take my pen in hand to write you a few lines to let you know that I am in New Orleans and am sold to a man by the name of Wright. I don't know how long I will stay. I wish you would write to me." Most of these letters never reached their destinations. As midnight approached on the Mississippi docks, lanterns illuminated the silhouettes of more enslaved people being loaded onto steamboats. The river itself became a liquid highway of human misery, carrying thousands downstream to plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The phrase, "sold down the river," originated here, a journey from which few returned. In the quiet darkness, the steamboat whistles echoed across the water, a mournful sound accompanying America's greatest crime as it spread across the continent, building wealth for some through the stolen lives of others. Freedom arrived with the 13th Amendment, yet its wording contained a fateful exception: except as punishment for crime. This loophole would ensnare generations. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Southern states enacted black code laws specifically designed to criminalize ordinary behaviors when performed by freed people. Vagrancy became an arrestable offense. Being unemployed became a crime. Even standing still could mean imprisonment. By 1880, thousands of former slaves found themselves trapped in a system nearly indistinguishable from the bondage they'd escaped. Prison farms stretched across fertile southern soil. Places like Parchman in Mississippi and Angola in Louisiana former plantations transformed into state penitentiaries where men labored from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eye of mounted guards with rifles and whips. Perhaps most brutal were the turpentine camps hidden deep in pine forests of Georgia and Florida. There, leased convicts spent their days scoring pine trees and collecting sticky resin in oppressive heat. They waded through snake-infested swamps, their lungs burning from caustic fumes. The mortality rate in these camps often reached 15% annually. More than 1 in 7 workers never left the forests alive. The industrial hunger of the New South demanded infrastructure. Chain gangs of shackled men swung hammers in rhythmic unison, driving steel spikes into wooden railroad ties mile after endless mile. Their songs echoed across southern valleys, coded laments carrying warnings, prayers, and memories of home. By 1890, convict labor had laid thousands of miles of railway track, connecting cities and ports, while the men who built them remained bound by iron. Even those who escaped direct imprisonment often found themselves ensnared by debt peonage. Company scrip replaced real wages in mining towns and lumber camps across the South. Workers were paid in tokens redeemable only at the company store, where prices were inflated beyond reason. A week's hard labor might earn enough scrip for basic supplies, with a little carried over on the books. The debt grew weekly, trapping families for generations in what one observer called slavery by another name. The pages yellowed with coal dust tell the story. From a journal recovered at Castle Rock mining camp, dated September 1905, worked 14 hours today. My hands bleed through the gloves now. They say I still owe $117 from last winter when Hannah took sick. Mr. Jensen added another $4 for the medicine. The new men arrived yesterday. 3 colored fellows from Alabama who thought they were hired fair, saw their faces when they learned about the scrip. Same look we all had once. Deputy watches the road. They say Cooley tried to leave last month. Nobody's seen him since. My boy turns 12 next week. Jensen says he's old enough for the low tunnels where I can't fit anymore. Lord help us, but I don't see any way out that doesn't end with blood. The writer's name has been lost to history, but his testimony remains. Morning comes gently to the red clay roads of Georgia. Mist rises from the ground in ghostly tendrils as the first light breaks through pine branches. In the distance, the rhythmic clanking of chains grows louder, then fades as another day of forced labor begins. By 1920, thousands of men, overwhelmingly black, remained caught in this shadow system no longer called slaves, but bound nonetheless. The convict leasing system would gradually fade through the early 20th century, but its legacy persisted in chain gangs, prison farms, and the mass incarceration that would follow. For those caught in its grasp between 1870 and 1920, emancipation remained an unfulfilled promise, freedom a word with hollow meaning, as they lived and died building a nation that refused to acknowledge their humanity. The morning mist clung to the rolling highlands as the sun's first light pierced through the acacia trees. For thousands of Kikuyu, Kamba, and Maasai people, dawn didn't bring promise but burden. The British had carved Kenya into a patchwork of white-owned estates, and the native Africans found themselves transformed into what colonists called shamba boys, laborers on land that had once been theirs. On these vast plantations, coffee and tea bushes stretched toward distant horizons. African men stooped between the rows, fingers raw from plucking leaves and berries. The rhythm of colonial agriculture was punishing 14 hours beneath the equatorial sun, 6 days weekly. Payment came not in currency but in hut privileges and meager food rations. Settler documents reveal one plantation owner's calculation: native labor costs 1/10 what European labor would require. The profit margins justify any complaint of harsh treatment. Women ground maize between stones while balancing infants on their backs. Children as young as 6 carried water, frightened by the overseer's kiboko, a whip fashioned from hippopotamus hide. The settlers' houses stood on hilltops, watching over their human property. Inside those houses, the houseboys moved silently, polishing silver and serving tea with gloved hands. They wore starched uniforms but slept on kitchen floors. Unlike earlier forms of slavery with its chains and auction blocks, colonial East Africa perfected something more insidious, a system where technically free people had no practical freedom. The squatter arrangement trapped families in perpetual debt. A Kikuyu elder recalled, "We signed papers we couldn't read. They said we could live on small plots if we worked the master's fields." But the hut tax kept rising. The more we worked, the more we owed. British administrative records show how the system functioned. Natives could occupy tiny parcels of ancestral land, but only by providing 180 days of labor annually to the European owner. They couldn't plant their own crops until the settlers' fields were tended. They couldn't leave without surrendering their homes. One colonial officer wrote home, "It's quite marvelous. They aren't slaves technically, which keeps London happy, but they're absolutely bound to us through their need for shelter." When drought came, the squatters starved while the settlers' irrigation systems kept coffee plants flourishing. When epidemics spread, African laborers died in their huts, while white families retreated to coastal sanitariums. The colonial courts offered no recourse. A man could be flogged for insolence, often nothing more than failing to bow properly when a European passed. Yet around nighttime fires, whispers began. Veterans returning from fighting in Britain's World War II armies brought dangerous ideas about dignity and self-determination. In hushed voices, stories spread of a resistance movement forming in the forests. They called it Mau Mau. A laborer named Kimathi spoke of oaths taken beneath moonlight, of promises to reclaim the land. Colonial authorities dismissed these rumblings as primitive superstition, but plantation owners doubled the night guards. "The Europeans believe we have forgotten who we are," an elderly woman told her grandchildren beside a smouldering evening fire. "But the land remembers. The mountains remember." As darkness settled over the highlands, the outline of an acacia tree stood stark against the night sky. Beneath it, laborers passed down stories of what came before the settlers, tales of ancestors who had owned this soil, who had never known masters. The flickering flames illuminated faces worn by labor, but alive with something the colonial system couldn't extinguish. Children fell asleep to songs in languages the overseers couldn't understand, lyrics preserving histories the British couldn't erase. Above them, stars wheeled across the African sky, the same stars their free ancestors had used for navigation, for planting, for celebration. Morning would bring another day of servitude, but the night belonged to memory, to resistance, to dreams of what might yet come. As the chains of chattel slavery were formally broken across the British Empire in 1834, a peculiar vacuum formed across the Caribbean's vast sugar estates. Plantation owners, unwilling to relinquish their fortunes, gazed anxiously across empty fields where enslaved Africans had once toiled. The sugar economy demanded bodies, and when the formerly enslaved refused to labor under nearly identical conditions for pitiful wages, colonial authorities sought new sources of exploitable labor. The solution materialized in villages across India, where British agents whispered promises into hungry ears. The Gamita corruption of the English word agreement offered passage across the Kalapani, the dark waters, to far-off islands where, they claimed, prosperity awaited. 5 years of labor, then freedom, and perhaps land of one's own, a contract signed with an X by those who couldn't read the English that bound them. Between 1838 and 1917, nearly 500,000 Indians would make this journey, their identities reduced to numbers in colonial ledgers. Many never understood they were traveling thousands of miles from home, believing Trinidad or British Guiana to be just another Indian district. The recruiters rarely mentioned the brutal conditions awaiting these coolies, a derogatory term that would come to define generations. The journey itself was a preview of the hardships to come, crowded below decks on ships eerily reminiscent of the Middle Passage that had carried enslaved Africans. Indentured Indians spent months at sea. Disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters. Dysentery, cholera, and smallpox claimed countless lives. Bodies were simply tipped overboard with minimal ceremony, the ship barely slowing its progress toward the sugar islands. Those who survived arrived disoriented and weakened, only to be immediately sorted and distributed to plantations. In Trinidad, they were housed in long wooden barracks divided into small rooms, each sheltering multiple families with only cloth separating one from another. Privacy was non-existent. The estate bell regulated their lives just as it had for enslaved Africans before them, ringing before dawn to summon workers to the fields and marking the end of daylight labor that sometimes stretched 14 hours. Payment came not in the promised coins but in credit at the plantation store, creating perpetual debt. Overseers, many of them formerly enslaved Africans, elevated to positions of limited power, enforced labor with fines and physical punishment. The letter of colonial law might have forbidden flogging, but isolated plantations operated by their own brutal code. Workers who complained found their contracts extended for lost time or faced imprisonment. Yet within this system of exploitation, cultural resistance bloomed like the unexpected flowers that sometimes pushed through the packed earth between rows of sugarcane. Hindu festivals transformed on Caribbean soil, merging with rhythms and traditions already woven into island life by Africans before them. The Festival of Hosei, commemorating the martyrdom of the Prophet Muhammad's grandsons, became an occasion where Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean laborers found common cause in elaborate processions that worried colonial authorities. During Diwali, the darkest nights of the year glowed with small clay lamps arranged around barracks, their light a defiant reminder of spiritual beliefs carried across oceans. Drums that had once spoken in African tongues now incorporated the tabla's voice. The steel pan, born from discarded oil drums in Trinidad's yards, found new melodies in the hands of Indian descendants. Cuisines melded roti wrapped around African-influenced stews, creating dishes neither culture had known before. Along the coastal roads where sugar estates stretched toward horizons, evening brought a particular quiet known to generations of indentured workers. As the Caribbean tide hushed against shorelines, cane fields rustled with their own ocean-like whisper. Workers returning to barracks after long days moved slowly along these paths, bodies aching but voices sometimes lifting in songs that traveled far across the plantations. Songs of distant homes in Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, of family left behind, of the hope that children might someday know something beyond the cutting of cane. This tide hush brought with it stories passed between generations of resistance, of ancestors, of spirits that moved between worlds. And in these twilight moments, as the day's labor settled into bone-deep exhaustion, indentured laborers found spaces of dignity between the formal lines of their contracts, breathing lives into existence that their colonial masters never fully controlled or understood. As empire stretched its fingers across the Pacific, ordinary lives became currency in a system few today remember with clarity. The Japanese Imperial Army's establishment of military brothels began in the early 1930s, accelerating dramatically after 1937. They called them comfort stations, a bureaucratic euphemism for institutionalized sexual slavery. Documents from military archives reveal the cold precision of logistics. 1 woman per 30 soldiers in rear positions, 1 per 40 at the front. How does one populate such a system? Rarely through honesty. Young women and girls, some barely 14, were approached with promises. Factory work, they were told, nursing positions, kitchen duties to support the war effort, good wages to send home to hungry families. Papers were signed by parents who couldn't read them. In colonial Korea, in occupied China, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, the pattern repeated with minor variations, like a folk melody adapted to local instruments but carrying the same haunting tune. Some were simply taken, rounded up in villages after men had been killed or conscripted, military police appearing at doorways with lists of names. The occupying forces needed not justify their selections. Records show over 200 women were processed through this system, though the true number remains contested, like so many details lost to the convenient fog of wartime record-keeping. The reality behind comfort station walls existed in cruel contrast to the promises. Women lived in rooms barely larger than the thin sleeping mats provided spaces more akin to cells than quarters. Windows, where they existed, were often covered to prevent escape attempts. Their days followed strict routines designed for maximum efficiency. Wake at dawn, wash with limited water rations, prepare for the first soldier by 7. Some stations processed 50 men daily through a single room, with queues forming outside during busy periods. Medical inspections came weekly, sometimes more frequently not for the women's benefit, but to protect the soldiers from disease. The injections of Salvarsan 606 for venereal disease burned like liquid fire in their veins. Medical orderlies kept meticulous records, patient numbers, not names. Subject 38, clear. Subject 39, treatment required. Humanity reduced to inventory. Diaries recovered decades later reveal the internal landscapes of these external prisons. One woman from Jeju Island recorded tiny acts of defiance in faint pencil strokes between mattress stitching, counting stars through a crack in the roof, whispering stories from home to the others after lights out, saving a single butterscotch candy for weeks, permitting herself just one lick each Sunday. Another kept a calendar marking not days but the number of men, stopping at 1,000 before the columns of neat tally marks dissolve into chaotic scribbles. When liberation finally came in August 1945, there was no system to process these women's experiences. No repatriation protocol for those transported far from home. Many, fearing the shame that awaited, never returned to their villages. Those who did often maintained decades of silencia, second prison built of societal judgment and internal trauma. The Allied powers, focused on rebuilding and containing communism, showed little interest in these particular war crimes. Documents were destroyed or classified. Testimonies went unrecorded. The long silence broke first as whispers in the 1970s, then as steadier voices in the 1980s. Kim Hak-sun became the first Korean survivor to publicly testify in 1991, already in her 60s. Her words fell like stones into still water. I was not alone. There were many of us. And we have waited long enough. The ripples spread slowly, encountering resistance from governments concerned with diplomatic relations and the inconvenient excavation of buried history. The rain comes most evenings during monsoon season. It starts as individual drops on the corrugated iron roofs of the hastily constructed barrack scintillated percussions that gradually merge into constant white noise. Former comfort women, interviewed decades later, speak often of this sound, how it provided both torment and relief, how it masked sounds they wished not to hear from adjacent rooms, how it offered the closest thing to privacy available, how eventually the steady drumming became a meditation, the only constant in a world where humanity had been suspended. In the spaces between raindrops, women would sometimes whisper to one another, sharing fragments of their former lives, like passing precious heirlooms hand to hand in darkness. Names of parents, descriptions of village festivals, recipes for dishes they would cook when they returned home, small assertions of identity in spaces designed to erase it. The rain would intensify, then gradually taper off before dawn, when the cycle would begin again, history's cruelest loop, playing on repeat until liberation or death provided the only possible escape routes from stations designed for comfort but delivering anything but. In the shadow of Stalin's 5-year plans, a parallel economy emerged, one built not on rubles but on human suffering. The Soviet security apparatus operated on arrest quotas, not evidence. Factory managers, university professors, farmers with one cow too many, all could vanish overnight under nebulous charges of sabotage or counter-revolutionary activities. Even a joke about potato shortages could earn you a decade in the frozen wilderness. The state needed labor, and the state would have it. Imagine falling asleep in your Moscow apartment, then waking to the 3 a.m. knock that everyone dreaded. No time for goodbyes. Your neighbors pretend not to hear as you're escorted downstairs. You've joined the invisible workforce, the Zeks. After weeks of interrogation, you're crammed into a Stolopinka railway car with 60 others. The journey to Kolyma in the Far East stretches across 6,000 miles of Soviet territory. Each day, the train stops briefly to remove the bodies of those who couldn't survive the journey. The guards joke that Kolyma is the land of white death and red gold, permafrost and precious metals. Few who enter this frozen corner of Siberia will ever leave. When you finally arrive, you understand why survivors call Kolyma the pole of cold. Here, the mercury regularly plunges to -40 degrees, the strange point where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet. Iron becomes brittle enough to shatter like glass. Exposed skin freezes in seconds. Yet tomorrow, you'll be cutting timber for 12 hours in this weather. Your new currency is bread, 300 grams if you meet your work quota, 200 if you don't. A perpetual mathematics of starvation. Scientific studies determine precisely how little food a human needs to perform hard labor without immediately collapsing. Calories became a cruel science, around 1,200 daily for most prisoners, barely half what your body requires for the backbreaking work. Camp doctors had a term for the result: nutritional dystrophy. You'd watch as fellow prisoners gradually faded, their bodies consuming themselves until nothing remained but hollow eyes and paper-thin skin stretched over bone. Your brigade trudges through snow-buried forests, assigned impossible timber quotas. The camp commanders have a saying, "We have more people than trees." Tools are primitive, dull saws and axes for the dense Siberian pines. The lucky ones operate in pairs. The unlucky haul logs alone through chest-deep snow. Frostbite claims fingers and toes, then hands and feet. The work continues regardless. By night, the bunkhouses become islands of whispered humanity. Inmates from across the Soviet Union share secret folk stories and compose new songs that will never be recorded. Political prisoners, engineers, poets, scientists teach impromptu classes using charcoal on birch bark. Mothers separated from children sing lullabies to empty air, hoping somehow the melody might travel thousands of miles to reach small ears. Guards pretend not to hear the forbidden remembrances of pre-revolutionary holidays or religious prayers. Even here, culture persists, a stubborn flame. A complex society emerges within the barbed wire. Professional criminals, the Urki, establish their own hierarchy separate from the political prisoners. They have their own language, tattoos as identity cards, and an elaborate code that forbids cooperation with authorities. The politicals develop their own methods of survival, sharing food, protecting the weakest, preserving knowledge. Some even manage to smuggle out testimony on cigarette papers sewn into clothing, determined that the world will someday know. Outside your barracks window, the aurora borealis sometimes dances across the night sky, rippling curtains of green and violet light illuminating the endless taiga. Nature's most beautiful spectacle performs nightly for those condemned to society's cruelest punishment. You wonder if anyone beyond the wire knows you exist, if your name has been erased from all records, replaced with just a number. Tomorrow will bring the same, the sores, the trees, the cold, the hunger. But tonight, watching the northern lights shimmer over the snow-covered pines, you permit yourself 5 minutes of beauty before sleep claims you. The mines of South Africa beckoned with promises of wages in an economy that had systematically stripped black Africans of their land and autonomy. But these were not ordinary jobs. They were elaborate systems of control, displacement, and exploitation that operated within apartheid's machinery. Men from rural areas across southern Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique, Malawi, found themselves caught in a web of migration that separated them from families for 11 months of every year. Some traveled hundreds of miles on foot, others packed onto trains like cattle, dreaming of enough money to pay colonial taxes or build a proper home. What awaited them was not opportunity, but a carefully designed system of labor extraction that would grind bodies down while keeping minds submissive. You could not simply arrive at a mine and seek work. The Dompas, the hated passbook, dictated where you could go, when you could go there, and for how long. Every black man over 16 carried this document, its dog-eared pages filling with stamps and signatures that determined the boundaries of his existence. Without it, you were nobody, subject to arrest, imprisonment, deportation. The Dompas was both identity and prison sentence, the physical manifestation of apartheid's obsession with control. Men signed labor contracts they often couldn't read, thumbprints binding them to terms that would shock the conscience of the outside world. A man who broke his contract faced blacklisting, ensuring his family would starve. Once signed, there was no turning back. Home became a concrete compound, a world of men only, 50 to a room in hostels built like military barracks, with narrow bunks stacked 3 high and concrete floors swept endlessly against the invasive mine dust. Privacy was a luxury found only in small rituals, the careful arrangement of a few possessions, photographs tucked under pillows. In the shafts, danger was constant. Support beams creaked under immense pressure as men drilled ever deeper into the Earth's crust. Diamond dust and coal particles suspended in poorly ventilated tunnels infiltrated lungs, planting seeds of silicosis that would flower years later into painful, gasping deaths. Company doctors performed cursory examinations, looking not for illness but for malingering. The sick were simply sent home without compensation to die in distant villages. Yet, even in this tightly controlled world, resistance found its voice. It emerged through gumboot dancing, Isakathulo, performed in rubber Wellington boots issued for work in flooded mine passages. The dancers stomped complex rhythms that spoke when words could not, slapping their boots and bodies in precisely timed sequences that carried coded messages of defiance. What began as entertainment became subversion. Mine managers watched these performances without understanding the satirical commentary embedded within them, caricatures of white bosses, mockery of arbitrary rules, expressions of home and heritage maintained despite systematic efforts to strip them away. The language of the body became the language of survival. At night, by weak candlelight, men composed letters home. Many dictated to the few who could write, asking about children growing up without fathers, crops planted without their hands to tend them. They sent money orders but couldn't send themselves. Some letters asked if the new baby had been named, though the child might be walking by the time the father returned. Responses, when they came, were treasured, read and reread until the paper grew thin. Through hostile windows came the distant sound of drumming, traditional rhythms adapted to new contexts, creating soundscapes that connected present suffering with ancestral resilience. The drums spoke of home, of dignity maintained despite indignity, of cultural threads that could not be severed by distance or oppression. Men listened as the sound traveled through ventilation shafts, a reminder that even in the depths of the earth, under apartheid's crushing weight, humanity persisted in finding its voice. In the dense forests of West Africa, where the air hangs heavy with moisture and the earth is rich and dark, grows a tree whose fruit has entangled millions in webs of modern servitude. The cacao tree, its pods yellow, orange and red dangle like festive ornaments, deceptively cheerful against the verdant backdrop. Within each pod lie the seeds of a global obsession, chocolate. The story of chocolate is a tale of two worlds that rarely intersect. In one, polished storefronts display artisanal truffles on velvet cushions, and smiling children unwrap foil-covered treats. In the other, children as young as 5 wield machetes nearly as tall as themselves, their small hands calloused from harvesting the very substance that sweetens distant lives. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana together produce nearly 70% of the world's cocoa. The math is simple and devastating. A chocolate bar selling for $4 in America or Europe might contain cocoa harvested by a child paid less than $1 for a 14-hour workday. The global chocolate industry generates over $100 billion annually, yet many cocoa farmers earn less than $2 per day. This is not ancient history. This is breakfast yesterday, the candy bar in your desk drawer, the hot chocolate warming cold hands this very moment. The children move through the plantations like shadows, often barefoot despite the venomous snakes that slither between rows of trees. They carry pesticide tanks strapped to their backs, containers of chemicals banned in wealthier nations for their toxicity. The liquid seeps through their clothes, burns their skin, enters their lungs with each breath. Many cannot read the warning labels that might save them from the worst exposures. School remains a distant dream, something glimpsed through the windows of passing vehicles carrying more fortunate children in pressed uniforms. "I wanted to be a teacher," whispers 12-year-old Kofi, his voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves. His eyes, already old, look down at hands mapped with tiny scars from cocoa pod harvesting. "But my father died, and someone must feed my sisters." He does not cry when he says this. Tears are a luxury afforded to children who still expect the world to be fair. In the village schoolhouse that stands empty 3 days each week when children must work instead of learn, faded alphabet charts curl in the humidity. Mathematics problems remain half-solved on chalkboards, waiting for students who may not return for days or weeks or ever. The arithmetic of survival trumps the equations of education, yet amid this landscape of exploitation, pockets of resistance flourish like stubborn wildflowers pushing through concrete. Local organizations, often founded by former child laborers themselves, work to break the chains. In a small compound built of cinder blocks and determination, Abina Mensa runs a shelter for children rescued from the plantations. "We cannot wait for foreign companies to develop a conscience," she says, serving rice to 30 former child laborers who now attend school. "We must save our own children." Her organization, Cocoa Children's Future, has rescued over 300 children in 6 years. They provide education, medical care, and legal advocacy. Most importantly, they help establish alternative income sources for families desperate enough to send their children into the plantations. The solution must address poverty, Abina explains. Moral outrage without economic alternatives changes nothing. In one village, former cocoa-dependent families now produce palm oil and raise bees for honey, their children attending school instead of wielding machetes. These success stories remain islands in a vast sea of exploitation, but they offer glimmers of what might be possible. As dawn breaks over the cacao groves, light filters through leaves still wet from seasonal rains. The pods glisten, beautiful and terrible in their silent witness to human suffering. A rooster crows, and the day cycle begins again. Children stir in their bedsome in homes, others in field shelters constructed of plastic tarps and fallen branches. The air smells of earth and possibility. The cacao trees stand impassive, neither good nor evil themselves, merely instruments through which human choice manifests. The choice to exploit, or the choice to protect, the choice to remain blind to distant suffering, or the choice to see beyond the sweetness to the bitter truth beneath. In the gleaming metropolises of our modern world, where skyscrapers reach toward heaven and streets pulse with ceaseless activity, a particularly insidious form of bondage persists in the shadows. Unlike the plantations and factories of historical slavery, these chains are forged behind closed doors, in luxury apartments and penthouse suites. Domestic servitude, the imprisonment of housekeepers, nannies, and home attendants, represents one of the most invisible forms of modern slavery, hidden within the very fabric of our urban centers. They arrive with dreams of supporting families back home, of education, of opportunity, yet for many, these aspirations evaporate the moment they step through their employer's door. Their passports disappear, confiscated for safekeeping, effectively erasing their legal existence. Their days stretch beyond human endurance, beginning before dawn with the preparation of breakfast and ending long after midnight. Once the family's dinner dishes are washed and put away, 20 hours of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and tending to every whim of their employers, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no days off, and often no pay beyond the most meager room and board. From the outside, these captives remain largely unseen. Yet occasionally, a face appears at a high-rise window as twilight settles over the city. A woman's palm pressed against glass, eyes scanning the streets below. Sometimes, it's a fleeting glimpse of someone standing on a balcony at an odd hour, or a figure visible for just moments before curtains are hurriedly drawn. These are the rare moments when the imprisoned become momentarily visible to the outside world. Some have developed subtle signals, a certain arrangement of laundry on a line, a specific pattern of switching lights on and off, or a plant positioned in a particular way on a windowsill. Silent SOS signals, understood perhaps only by others from their homeland, communicating distress without words. Yet within this darkness, threads of hope emerge. The proliferation of mobile phones has created lifelines where once there were none. A domestic worker might secretly send text messages to hotlines while her employers sleep, or connect with advocacy organizations using borrowed devices. Communities form in digital spaces where information is shared about rights, escape routes, and supportive networks. In response to increasing awareness, some nations have implemented legal reforms specifically addressing domestic servitude. Mandatory contracts, regulated working hours, guaranteed days off, and the critical right to retain personal identification documents represent hard-won protections, though enforcement remains deeply inconsistent across the globe. As night descends fully upon the city, millions of lights twinkle from countless windows, each one telling its own story. Behind some gleams the warmth of family life, behind others the glow of solitary contemplation or creative endeavor. Yet behind certain illuminated panes exist stories the city would rather not acknowledge, people cooking meals they cannot share, cleaning homes they cannot leave, and caring for children they may love deeply but who will never know their caregiver's true name or story. As traffic hushes below and the urban rhythm slows to its gentlest nocturnal pace, these invisible captives continue their work, hoping that tomorrow might bring the chance at freedom that today did not deliver. In apartments both modest and magnificent, they remain hidden in plain sight, their bondage disguised as employment, their imprisonment masked by the very walls of prosperity they maintain. We often imagine slavery as a relic of distant eras, yet millions remain caught in invisible chains behind the gleaming facades of modern manufacturing. The smartphone in your pocket, those crisp new sneakers, that bargain-priced t-shirt each, may carry the fingerprints of people who never chose their labor. In industrial zones across Southeast Asia and beyond, recruiters prowl rural villages with promises of stable wages in faraway cities. They front travel costs, documentation fees, training expenses debts that transmute into bondage once workers arrive. A Bangladeshi man might find himself owing 18 months' wages before his first day at the sewing machine. A Vietnamese woman discovers her passport confiscated until she repays recruitment fees, tripled by undisclosed interest. Their labor becomes the collateral, their freedom, the cost. Inside these facilities, time stretches like taffy. Workers crouch at stations for 12, 14, 16 hours, fingers moving with metronomic precision as production quotas tick upward with each passing quarter. Electronics workers apply microscopic components with tweezers until their vision blurs, inhaling solvents that slowly poison their nervous systems. Garment workers race against clocks as supervisors pace behind them, tracking each completed piece on clipboards, calculating whether termination might improve efficiency. When darkness falls, exhausted bodies shuffle toward crowded dormitories stacked like shipping containers on factory perimeters. 8, 12, sometimes 16 people share rooms designed for 4. Privacy exists only in whispered phone calls home, explaining why this month's remittance will again fall short. Sleep comes in fragmented bursts between the snoring of roommates working opposite shifts. Dreams are interrupted by quota alarm-piercing reminders that another day awaits. Factory owners have perfected the choreography of compliance audits. When inspectors arrive, usually announced despite protocols stating otherwise, certain workers vanish, whisked to back rooms or given unexpected holidays. Documentation materializes showing reasonable hours, fair wages, proper safety equipment. Hidden second sets of books track the reality. Workers rehearse answers. Yes, I freely chose this job. No, I've never worked more than 8 hours daily. Yes, I receive all mandated breaks. The price of honest answers might be termination or worse. Yet small revolutions flicker within this darkness. Consumer movements have forced transparency into supply chains that once operated behind impenetrable curtains. Workers smuggle cell phone footage to advocacy groups. Certification programs with actual teeth have emerged, requiring unannounced inspections, confidential worker interviews, and transparent pricing practices. Companies increasingly realize the marketing value of verifiable ethical sourcing, though many still chase the cheapest labor, regardless of human cost. Some regions have seen significant improvement: higher wages, reasonable hours, actual enforcement of labor laws, while others merely push exploitation deeper into shadows. The true map of modern slavery shifts constantly, adapting to scrutiny like water, finding new paths around obstacles. In a factory somewhere, neon strobes dim as another night shift ends. Workers punch time cards, shuffle through security checkpoints, and emerge squinting into dawn light. They board company buses that will deposit them at dormitories just as day shift workers vacate still warm beds. Tomorrow will mirror today, which mirrored yesterday. Yet, even within these grinding routines, resistance takes root: workers, passing information, building solidarity, finding moments of genuine connection across shared meals. The most profound form of resistance remains their stubborn humanity, preserved despite systems designed to reduce them to production units. Their stories flow invisibly through supply chains, embedded in the objects filling our homes. In the soft glow of computer screens, a new form of bondage emerged. Unlike the iron shackles of ancient servitude, these chains were invisible digital tethers binding vulnerable souls to exploitation through fiber optic cables and wireless signals. The 21st century's slave quarters became cramped apartments with blackout curtains, where children and young adults performed on command, their bodies commodified into pixels for distant strangers. The economics of online grooming operated with cold efficiency. In places like Angeles City and Cebu in the Philippines, recruiters sought those with the perfect combination of desperation and naivety. A mother of 4 might be offered what seemed like legitimate work, only to find herself trapped in debt bondage, forced to perform sexual acts on camera, to pay for training fees and equipment costs that mysteriously multiplied. Children, some as young as 7, were told they were simply playing games or dancing for nice foreigners who wanted to help their families. One room in Manila housed 11 children, all related, all performing for a choreographed horror show directed by their aunt. The business model was brutally simple, approximately $30 per viewer per hour, with operatives taking 70% and victims receiving small privileges like occasional meals or brief respite from violence. These operations produced nothing tangible, just electrical impulses carrying human degradation across continents, leaving no physical evidence beyond the haunted expressions on young faces. The rescues happened like whispers. Organizations working with local authorities would infiltrate networks after months of intelligence gathering. They moved at dawn, when operators slept heaviest, their raids coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously. Children found themselves suddenly free, though freedom itself was initially terrifying after months or years of programmed compliance. In rehabilitation centers scattered across Southeast Asia, former captives sat in quiet classrooms, learning skills that had nothing to do with performance. A 16-year-old boy, exploited since 12, struggled to make eye contact but could skillfully repair computer hardware, the very technology once used to abuse him now becoming his path toward healing. Counselors knew recovery wasn't linear. Nightmares alternated with breakthrough moments of unexpected laughter, or the first genuine smile in years. When global pandemic lockdowns descended in early 2020, the digital slavery industry experienced a grotesque boom. As legitimate businesses collapsed and unemployment soared, traffickers found vulnerable recruits with unprecedented ease. Simultaneously, global demand skyrocketed as isolated customers sought connection through screens. Law enforcement, diverted to pandemic response, left gaps that predators quickly exploited. One operation in Mindanao expanded from 3 victims to 27 in a single month, during the height of quarantine measures. The peculiar cruelty of this modern bondage was its psychological dimension. Unlike historical slaves who understood their captivity, many victims of online exploitation existed in a gray area of manipulation, technically able to walk away, yet imprisoned by threats, shame, and carefully cultivated dependency. Some developed disassociation so profound they spoke of their online personas in the third person, a psychological distance necessary for survival. As darkness gradually surrendered to morning light, keyboard clicks faded into the rhythmic hum of electric fans. Young bodies finally collapsed into exhausted sleep, their dreams interrupted by phantom notification sounds. Outside, roosters announced dawn, while inside, the cursors blinked patiently, waiting for another cycle of exploitation to begin. Modern slave drivers, needing neither whip nor chain, controlling their captives through screens that illuminated tears no viewer paid to see. In the shadow of our modern world, where gleaming towers of progress reach toward the sky, an ancient darkness lingers in forgotten corners. 27 million souls remain in bondage today, more than at any point in human history. Yet unlike the institutionalized slavery of centuries past, today's chains are hidden behind locked factory doors, within private homes, or deep in remote work camps far from prying eyes. The modern abolition movement operates with quiet determination across continents. Organizations with modest offices and dedicated staff maintain vast networks of informants, investigators, and rescuers. They move like gentle currents through troubled waters, identifying victims and creating pathways to freedom. Their methods have evolved with technology, developing smartphone applications allowing truck drivers, hotel workers, and everyday citizens to report suspicious activities without endangering themselves. These digital tools create a soft mesh of vigilance across transportation routes and exploitation hotspots, each alert a tiny beacon of hope in a vast sea of indifference. The true measure of freedom, however, isn't found in the moment of rescue, but in what follows. Former enslaved persons often carry invisible wounds alongside physical scars. Recovery centers have learned that healing often comes through the hands, through reconnection with traditional crafts and skills. In Nepal, women once trafficked into brothels now weave intricate textiles, their fingers remembering patterns taught by grandmothers long ago. In Ghana, young men who spent childhoods harvesting cocoa under threat of violence now learn sustainable farming practices, transforming the very fields that once imprisoned them. These artisans don't merely produce goods. They reconstruct identities stolen from them, stitch by patient stitch, harvest by peaceful harvest. Education forms another cornerstone of recovery. Literacy programs operate by lamplight in rural communities, where children were once sold to pay family debts. Former child soldiers study mathematics in quiet classrooms, their pencils now the only tools in their calloused hands. These educational initiatives extend beyond academics, teaching financial literacy to prevent debt bondage and providing vocational training tailored to local economies. Knowledge flows like water, nourishing possibilities that exploitation had withered. Legal progress against modern slavery moves with glacial patience. International treaties condemning human trafficking gather signatures slowly, each ratification representing years of diplomatic pressure and advocacy. National laws are passed, then languish without enforcement funding or political will. Yet persistent lawyers and judges chip away at legal barriers, creating precedents that strengthen with each case. Supply chain transparency laws now require companies to examine their production networks for forced labor, gradually illuminating hidden exploitation. Corporate liability for overseas abuses expands through courtroom victories measured in decades rather than months. This legal landscape shifts imperceptibly like continental drift, slow but ultimately reshaping the terrain. Perhaps most powerful are the rituals of remembrance and solidarity that sustain the movement through disappointments and setbacks. Each year, in ports where slave ships once docked, in cities built by enslaved hands, and along riverbanks where bodies were discarded, communities gather as darkness falls. They light candles, creating constellations of remembrance that mirror the stars above. Soft hymns rise from these gatherings, songs born in plantation fields or whispered in underground railroad stations, melodies that have carried hope through centuries of struggle. Survivors sometimes speak, their testimonies offered like precious gifts, voices steady where once they were silenced. These vigils remind us that while slavery has adapted and hidden itself throughout human history, so too has resistance persisted. The struggle for universal freedom continues not as a single dramatic battle, but as countless small acts of vigilance, care, and courage. Whether through the glow of smartphone screens reporting suspicious activity, through the rhythmic work of healing hands creating beauty from pain, through the patient documentation of legal violations, or through the warm light of memorial candles, modern abolitionists continue a tradition as old as bondage itself, the unwavering belief that no human being should belong to another. As our journey winds to its close, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of memory, looking back across the vast expanse of human history. The stories we've explored from ancient Mesopotamia to the plantations of the American South, from the galley ships of the Mediterranean to the debt bondage of industrial Europeans, narratives form a tapestry of human experience that stretches across millennia. In each era, in each system of bondage, we've encountered the same human spirit, facing different manifestations of the same fundamental injustice. Through the darkness of these histories runs a golden thread of resilience. In the shadow of the pyramids, enslaved families whispered stories of their homelands. In the crowded barracks of Rome, a mother's gentle hand wiped away a child's tears. Beneath the watchful eyes of overseers in cotton fields, secret gatherings drew strength from shared suffering. This resilience wasn't always dramatic rebellion more often. It was found in small, daily acts of perseverance, the careful preservation of cultural traditions, the tender tending of gardens in scraps of free time, the teaching of children when no one was watching. Family, too, emerges as a constant across these diverse experiences. Whether blood relations or bonds formed in the crucible of shared hardship, these connections sustained the human spirit. When biological families were torn apart, sold away, or separated by death, new kinship networks formed from the fragments. Names were remembered, lineages recited in hushed tones. In the face of systems that sought to reduce humans to property, these family bonds were perhaps the most profound form of resistance. And then there was song. From the work chants of ancient Egyptian builders to the spirituals of American plantations, from the laments of Ottoman palace servants to the rhythmic call and response of Caribbean cane fields music, provided both solace and subversion. Songs carried coded messages, preserved forbidden languages, and maintained connections to ancestral traditions. The human voice, lifted in melody, became a vehicle for emotions too complex and dangerous to express directly. Even when words were monitored, the cadence and tone could convey what couldn't be spoken. The forms of bondage we've examined varied dramatically. Some enslaved persons could own property and eventually purchase freedom. Others faced generational servitude with no hope of release. Some worked alongside their enslavers, while others labored under distant, anonymous ownership. Legal codes ranged from offering limited protections to codifying brutal treatment as right and proper. Yet through this diversity of experience runs the common, persistent quest for freedom, not merely freedom from chains, but freedom to exist fully as human beings, to make choices, to dream, to love. As night deepens around us, and as our exploration comes to its end, I invite you to breathe deeply, to sit with these echoes of the past. To remember that history is never truly distant, it shapes our present moment, informs our understanding, guides our moral compass. These stories belong to all of us, not as abstract lessons but as living memories that demand our acknowledgement. Rest now if you wish. Let these histories settle gently in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Listen closely, and perhaps you might hear Ita lullaby, carried on the night breeze, sung by 1,000 voices across time. A melody that began in ancient Sumer, picked up by Egyptian hands, harmonized by Roman voices, sustained through medieval fields, plantation cabins, and industrial tenements. A song of sorrow, yes, but also of hope. A reminder that while systems of bondage have existed throughout human history, so too has the irrepressible yearning for freedom.